Hey guys, welcome to the Smart Venture Podcast. In each episode, we're going to have conversations with some of the top investors, superstar founders, as well as well-known tech company executives in Silicon Valley. We'll have a coffee chat with them to learn their way of thinking and actionable tips on how they build or invest in a successful company. Before we start our show today, I want to make sure the listener, aka you, understand that everything a person say on the podcast only reflects hers or his own opinion, not the show or the company they work at. Our guest today is the Chief Product Officer of the Engineering Division at Goldman Sachs. As a professional cyclist, he competed in the Olympics and rode alongside Lance Armstrong on the USPS Pro Cycling Team. Then he pivoted his career to lead product teams at tech companies like Google, Path, Yahoo, and Fair. He is also an LP at Next Ventures and co-founded the media company WEDÜ Inc. with Lance Armstrong. His name is Dylan Casey. Welcome to the show, Dylan.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's fun to talk to you.
I think it's so impressive when someone can succeed in one sector in their career, but you succeed on being both a great athlete and now a tech leader. That's incredible. To start off the show, I would love to go back to your childhood a little bit. You grew up in Walnut Creek and Oakland. You studied communications and information system in college. Then you became a professional cyclist. Tell us more about how you became who you are today.
Yeah, no, sure. So, I was thinking about this today, knowing that you and I were going to talk, and a couple of things kind of popped into my head just thinking about your questions. And in that, first of all, there's like no formula. I could never do this intentionally. You know what I mean? Like, it's always easy to look at somebody's career or their accomplishments and, kind of think about how they appear to be amazing. But, in retrospect, looking back on it, it never felt amazing. You know what I mean? Like, It only looks amazing looking backwards. And in fact, and we can talk about this a little bit more. I'm a year into a new job at a bank in an industry I've never worked in, all over Zoom. And it's incredibly hard. Like there are days where I wake up and I'm like, I think I made a mistake, or I don't think I'm going to be able to do this job, or, I'm going to get fired. And then I just have to remind myself, I'm like, oh no, wait, this is part of the journey. This is it. This means I'm doing the work. And so I think, when I look back to, the things that I did when I was growing up and kind of like, is there any correlation or connection to what I'm doing now? And I think, my dad will joke that, we would be driving, I was a little boy and we would be driving down the street during Christmas, and I would be pointing out all the trees that had lights out. I would say, hey, Dad, there's a tree over there and one of the lights is out, or hey, that person has a Christmas decoration on their porch and there's a light out, or it's not straight, or, so I was always just kind of like fascinated and gravitated towards problems. And I always wanted to fix them. And so I think I was just like really drawn to this whole concept of solving problems. And that was something that it's kind of prevalent in almost everything that I've done, is really thinking about like, okay, I don't like what I see, or I don't like what's going on right now, or I don't like what I'm doing. So I'm going to change it, or I'm going to find a way to make it better. And that's really been kind of the catalyst for all of the significant, decisions that I've made, and and kind of, especially when it comes to career transitions or, big life decisions. And so it's funny because, as a parent now, it's instinctual to try to like create an environment and help my children with a framework or an approach that will set them up for success. And it's incredibly terrifying because it's like, wait a minute, I couldn't recreate my own success. How am I going to do it for somebody else? But I think, again, just going back to what I was really saying, that's just part of the journey. You have to there's really truth in appreciating the process more than the end.
Absolutely. One event that really shows your character is when you were transitioning from an athlete to working in tech. You had an interview at Apple. The interviewer started asking your experiences of cycling with Lance Armstrong. They may not have treated you seriously after you made a lot of effort to prepare for the interview. There were a lot of moments that you could have just quit. Eventually, you landed a job at Google. You call it at the mailroom, an entry-level job because of your friends' recommendations. Obviously, you're very successful now. It shows a lot of resiliency. Can you chat a bit about how you adapt yourself into the right mindset? Since at that point, you probably were in your late 20s when other people in the room were in their early 20s. You had to reinvent yourself on a different career trajectory.
Yeah. So, I had really achieved and kind of realized this dream of being a professional athlete, excuse me, and getting to compete on the world stage at the pinnacle of the sport, and really get to be part of an amazing story with plenty of controversy. But there was a point in time where I just woke up one day and realized that. And this has kind of been a common theme throughout my life, is that I never want to look back and have regrets. And I was actually, I might mess up the math, but I think I was 31 or 32 when I decided to, basically stop earning a living riding a bike and, try to earn a living working in the technology industry. And, I was very fortunate, lots of great connections. It was my girlfriend at the time that got me the interview at Apple because she worked at Apple. But then I also had, I had a really good friend, Jeremy Winokur and Bill Hudak, who worked at Google, and they were both cyclists. And they said, hey, Google is, strategically, trying to hire people with diverse backgrounds or just, kind of diverse ways of thinking, why don't, we'll try to get you an interview. Mm-hmm. And, the most obvious place to start for somebody like me was marketing. Because if you think about professional sports, it's a marketing platform. And I understood that well. I had my own website at the time, which, there were no blogging platforms. So I actually had to learn how to code myself and how to manage, an FTP server over a dial-up modem in random hotels all throughout Europe. So that was kind of like my self-taught way of understanding technology and users and website traffic and advertising. And so when I got the interview and I went to Google and kind of shared, what my story was, I think that resonated with them because it was, to some degree entrepreneurial. I think athletes by nature are entrepreneurial. Mm-hmm. And I kind of, I had a basic understanding of what Google was trying to do with regards to, giving people and advertisers, a really meaningful, useful platform to connect in a relevant way. And so that got me the job. Now, my job literally was like, I used to joke, everybody jokes, I had the key to the t-shirt closet for all the free Google t-shirts. Turns out I was probably like the third or fourth most, powerful person in the company because I had access to unlimited t-shirts. And you'd be amazed at what you could get done, when you could give out t-shirts and hats and Google swag, because these scenarios, Google was small enough and still the roles were not like narrow in scope. So for example, I got a request, and I don't know why, but for some reason, every single request to use Google's brand, not just in like advertising or marketing, but like, for example, somebody would say, hey, we're shooting a movie and we want to use a scene where somebody's searching for Google or searching on Google for something. And those approvals would land on my desk. Well, I started thinking to myself, I'm like, wait a minute, these might be interesting opportunities for us to essentially kind of expose things that we're working on that are not necessarily ready to launch, but we might kind of try them out in a cool, interesting way, almost like an Easter egg, right? Mm-hmm. So long story short, I just started doing more and more of these. And I started, going to the engineers and asking, hey, could you make a tweak to this API so that we could use it or make it available to HBO, who's building a map showing all of these significant, events that happened in various episodes of Sopranos, such that when somebody clicked on this icon in the map, it would open up a video player to show that clip from Sopranos. Now, granted, this is like 2003 and 4. Like, this was not easy to do. And so anyway, it was just kind of like trying to find ways to really achieve what Google's objectives were in interesting ways. And the more and more I did that, the more opportunities I got. And, that was really how I was able to learn and get to work on lots of interesting projects and work with lots of interesting people. And so I think that was one of the keys to kind of my early success there.
Yeah, absolutely. You took small steps, paid attention to your job. Instead of thinking it's a mediocre job, you really leverage what you know and what you've observed to have more responsibilities. Make incremental steps, and treating what you do seriously as a great mindset to approach any work. Speaking of how you get a job at Google, you had a friend work at Google, your girlfriend at the time worked at Apple. You were not only surrounding yourself with people that are successful athletes, but also people that are smart in business. Do you intentionally build friendships with the smartest people? Who is on your personal board of advisors when it comes to career decisions?
Well, I think I'll give you kind of a two-part answer. So one, I have this very vivid memory of when I was in college at Santa Barbara, and there was this little coffee stand, and it was kind of in a major, kind of like thoroughfare for the campus. So like when classes were switching, almost everybody would walk down this path. So anyway, it was kind of a habit. I'd sit there with a coffee and reading the paper. And, inevitably somebody would be sitting next to you. And I was always enamored with the idea that, at that particular moment in time, I could make a choice to talk to the person next to me, like to say, hey, well, how's it going? Well, how's your day? Or, what class are you heading to? And the idea that conversation could have a potentially significant impact on the rest of my life was incredible. Now I know I'm kind of like, sounds like some sort of like, movie or like a scene out of a silly movie, but I've always really appreciated the opportunity of serendipity. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to relationships and people that I've, connected with, I think I've always looked for, I always say how lucky I've been. And I think one of the things that I've done a good job of is putting myself in the position to be lucky. And that's by being open to connections. And I have a good friend of mine, Chris Newman, who I randomly met at a cycling trade show because I was there. I was like an amateur. I was literally living off of power bars and prize money. Mm-hmm. And I was looking for a sponsor, and he was the marketing director of a company that was just, starting to become prominent in the industry. And, long story short, we connected and I went on to have this professional career. And right as I was, going to live in Europe, he was quitting his job and moving to San Francisco to chase the startup dream. And so what was interesting is that I was kind of living vicariously through him while I was off racing around Europe. But he and I always connected on this level. But I think one of the things that was really great about our relationship, and is true even today, is that we could kind of talk to each other, directly, mm-hmm. and kind of like be critical of each other. And so I think you have to surround yourself with people that are going to give you real talk. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's a common thing. So I'm certainly not the creator of that idea. But just, I try to really have people that I can rely on and, really have open conversations with. And then at the same time, I think just like putting yourself out there and like looking for opportunities to be lucky is really key. And the hard part is it doesn't always seem that way in the moment.
Yeah.
So it's tough.
Yeah. There's always some sort of serendipity to it. Maybe you're gravitating towards people that are also really driven. Maybe you made efforts to expose yourself to better opportunities. So you attract people that are also really ambitious. Throughout your athletic and tech career, what would you say is one skill that you're constantly trying to get better at?
Oh, I don't have one. I have like 30. I think it's interesting because it probably, at different times and different scenarios, it's different. I think right now, especially because I'm dealing with this, incredibly challenging role at a new company in a new industry, not to mention during a global pandemic, that I find myself lately really spending a lot of time to be very, very careful about my assumptions, right? Like I'm trying to think clearly about, okay, what is potentially clouding my decision right now based on my past? And so it's almost kind of like an introspective way to challenge myself. And a lot of that has to do with just being mindful about, okay, when can I take time to think about this decision versus when do I need to make a decision right away? And for me, like something that has been very, very prevalent and common throughout a lot of my approaches to or the way that I approach problems is ensuring that I have the right amount of context. Mm-hmm. And this is always, it's interesting because when I think about interviewing people for product management roles, or when I've been in the seat of interviewing for a role, and, inevitably, I think a classic question is like, oh, well, what changes would you make to this company or to this product? And I find myself, I always get perplexed with the question because I feel like until I've been like living and eating and breathing the problem for a couple of months, I can't possibly know what to do. And I think that's an example of where I really thrive on having lots of context. Mm-hmm. So I think, just from like skill or attribute that I try to work on, I think it's different all the time, but I think just being open to the idea that you have to constantly be working on things mm-hmm. is an approach that served me well and is kind of like how I think about things. I think it's people talk about it like a growth mindset. I think it's innate for athletes because you're constantly trying to improve your performance and there's all these variables that impact it. I think today's athletes are a lot more mindful about that. Everything from mental health to your relationship health and how much impact those things have on your physical performance, right? And mm-hmm. so I think the same thing is true for how we approach how we perform at work. And so it's like this constant growth, right? Like constantly pushing mm-hmm. to grow and be better.
You mentioned previously that athletes are in marketing business. Why is that?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, at a very simplistic level, athletes are more or less providing entertainment, right? If you mm-hmm. look at it from a business perspective. And that's obviously a gross simplification of it. Mm-hmm. But specifically when it comes to, sports like professional cycling, a team or even an individual is more or less a platform for advertisers to reach an audience, mm-hmm. right? So, if you're building a cycling specific product, obviously cycling athletes are, a great way to tap into a specific audience or user base. And so I think that that's, kind of a very narrow scope. But in general, in addition to the kind of mechanics around the business application, there's also this emotional aspect of it, right? Mm-hmm. Like we get inspired by people who achieve greatness. And there's an emotional experience around that. And that emotional experience is very much a big part of advertising and marketing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think some of the best marketers and the best advertisers understand that, and they truly know how to, take the really critical part about sports, which is the story and the narrative, and then make that relevant to their product and tie it in so that it's a seamless experience for the potential user or customer.
Yeah, totally. You started your career in marketing. Now you're a successful product leader. How do you make the transition?
Yeah, so I think product, it's basically there's so many definitions of it, and there's kind of like the very old school idea of product manager, which is like, I'm going to go out and collect requirements from my customers, and then I'm going to go back to the engineers and build a roadmap to build those features and then turn around and sell it to the clients, right? And I think that that's kind of a simplistic view, but over the years, and because all of the interfaces are much more evolved, being a product manager is really around understanding the problem, being able to break it down, understanding from an empathy perspective what the customer really wants or is really experiencing, and then being able to put it into some sort of plan that a team can execute on. And then the really important part is having the discipline to understand how and when to make the trade-offs that are going to be inevitable along that journey. Because like the first thing I always talk about or ask about when, I'm talking to somebody or a company about product management in general, my first question is, how do you plan? What's your process? How do you decide what your priorities are? Right. And then more importantly, how do you stick to them? How do you adjudicate, disagreements or what's the venue or ritual that you have for making those trade-offs? And then how do you communicate them? What's the ripple effect? How do you manage all of those cascading effects of decisions? And so, effective product managers really understand how to put all of those pieces together. And they also understand how to move in and out of modes, right? Because in some modes, you're really thinking about the problem. In other modes, you're really thinking about how to execute. And in other modes, you're thinking about how to talk with business leaders and stakeholders. And, one of the most critical attributes is being able to tell the story, like being able to put it into a narrative that is relevant to the stakeholder, such that they understand, okay, now I get it. And this is, essentially how all boats are going to rise with the tide. So I think, if I go back and have to like reverse engineer how I got here, was really, understanding or being able to leverage my, kind of like almost OCD level of problem solving. And then understanding how to create a plan and how to execute that plan. And then, like launching a product or making it available to customers or putting it in customers' hand. It's the same thing as showing up, to the start of the race and essentially performing, right? You've done all this work, like racing is no different. You've done all this work to prepare, and then you show up on race day and it's time to perform. And how do you deal with pressure? And how do you deal with the adversity that you had to deal with along the way? Like those are all applicable, whether it's in sports or business.
Yeah, totally. I like what you said about at the job, you need to figure out how does a company plan things? What's their priority? How do they stick with the plan? Different priorities will define different scope of work. At Google, Path, Yahoo, Fair, and now at Goldman Sachs, you work at so many different sectors. What's a different product philosophy behind those different products?
Yeah. So, they're all different and unique. And they all have, and by the way, the companies were or are all in different phases of their life cycle when I was there. Like, for example, even at Google, when I joined in 2003 to when I left in 2012 was like a completely different company a couple times, right?
Yeah.
When I walked out of, I like to say I graduated from Google and went to work at Path, I was employee 19. I was the only product manager, right? There was, the problem surface area, as I like to call it, was completely different. And so I had to adapt everything that I had done before to be applicable to the context of Path and the problems that we were facing as a startup. And so, that was actually the first time where I kind of understood how to take something that I had done or understood a general framework and then adjust it and modify it to work in a different context. And I think there's phases that you go through, and that's even more true in the role that I'm in right now, where I'm not playing the role of an individual contributor as much, right? Mm-hmm. Like what I'm being held accountable for is different. And so you have to kind of like go back to first principles and, really get clarity around, what are the problems that you're going to solve and in what order, mm-hmm. right? Like right now I'm solving problems that are essentially going to create the foundation for what we want to accomplish in the future. So before mm-hmm. we can build the house, we have to have a really solid, well-defined foundation. So that's where we're at. Whereas in those other companies, they were at different stages and had different sets of requirements. And so I had to have a completely different approach. And so I think that's one of the key things. And then also, the hardest thing about going from being an individual contributor to essentially being a manager is that as an IC, you pretty much know every single detail. Right. Mm-hmm. And I always think that great product managers, they know what's happening in the roadmap. They can tell you exactly when something's going to be delivered and why and what the story is and, which engineer is working on what. And as you become a manager, you have less fidelity with regards to those details. And so you have to kind of create a more macro narrative that says, okay, well, this is how these three teams are going to come together in concert to tell this broader story. Right. And so part of my job now is really around crafting that story and telling it in such a way that everybody can understand how their individual work rolls up into this broader objective. Mm-hmm. And so it's like I become much more of a storyteller than anything else at this point.
Yeah, like you said, when you work as an individual contributor, you need to understand the detail about a product, solve a particular problem. Now, as a manager, you need to oversee the whole picture, tell the whole story. When you first join a company, we can use Goldman Sachs or any other company as an example. What's the first day like at your job? How do you figure out what's a core problem the company is trying to solve?
Yeah. Well, the first day, and I actually kind of break it up into like, the first 2 weeks, the first month, the first 6 months, the first year. Mm-hmm. And I always, having had a couple of new jobs, over the last couple of years, I've definitely subscribed to the approach of don't say anything for at least 2 weeks, just like listen and observe as much as possible. In fact, that should probably be more like a month or two. Mm-hmm. Because again, I think you need all of that context before you can really have a credible opinion. Mm-hmm. And also it's the worst when somebody comes in and is like, oh, well, this is how we did it at company X or at my last mm-hmm. company. And so that's something that I try to be really careful about. And, I'm not always successful at it, but I try super hard. Mm-hmm. But I think that, when you're coming into a new role, it's really, really critical to take advantage of that time because, you're only new once. Mm-hmm. And, I always joke that it's kind of like the first week at school because you don't have any papers due or you don't have any homework yet. So you should mm-hmm. really take advantage of that. Mm-hmm. But, I think just like with anything, you should kind of have a plan, right? Mm-hmm. In the beginning of, the first couple of weeks at Goldman Sachs, I think I spent almost every day, all day long, meeting with people mm-hmm. and just kind of asking questions and getting to understand what they, what their mm-hmm. problems were and what kept them up at night. And it's also an opportunity to kind of learn as much as possible about the company. Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's critical. And it's also, it's a chance to basically say, to get clarity around, what it is that you want to accomplish and how you think you're going to accomplish it. I think the OKR framework that John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins and Google have kind of made, notable is a really good framework. And I used it when I was an athlete. I didn't know it was called the OKR framework, but I used it, it was kind of how I thought about, my training program. And so it's the same model. But I think that, that's really the most valuable thing is just to be mindful and have a lot of intention in the beginning.
In terms of putting together the actual strategy, how do you execute on your initial vision? In the first 2 weeks or first couple weeks, you would use that time to chat with other people to learn more. After collecting the information, how do you come up with a vision and how do you present that to the core leadership team to make sure people are on board?
So I think, it's almost inevitable that when you walk into a company, there's already a plan in process, right? Or there's already a plan in flight. So I think to some degree, it's more valuable to just drop in and try to experience as much as possible before having any point of view on or just before you have a point of view, right? And I can tell you that the point of view I have now is entirely different than the point of view I had the first month and even the first 6 months. And, this is especially true. I remember this about Yahoo because I stepped into a role, with my engineering partner, who's now the CTO at Goldman Sachs, which is how I got there. But Ate and I, we started on the same day at Yahoo, and really neither one of us knew what we were supposed to do or what the job was. I mean, we just knew that we were going to be running this platform organization. But we didn't really understand the problem. We didn't really understand what the opportunity was. We needed to make sense of why, how did the platform team fit into the overall strategy that the company had? And it really took time for us to understand that. And so I think we both just jumped in, and this is true at Goldman Sachs as well. We just jumped in and tried to live and touch, taste, smell the problem as much as possible. And it's in that process that you start to identify opportunities, right? You start to think, you start to see, oh, here's some ways, that we can really leverage or take advantage of the strengths of what we have. And here are some weaknesses that we can address. And then once you start to kind of like catalog those, a plan starts to emerge, right? So I think one of the biggest potential pitfalls that I have made, and I've seen other people make too, is try to come up with a plan too quickly, right? Like I think there's something to be said for taking time and really kind of testing some small hypothesis early on. And again, back to what I said earlier. Right now, I'm spending a lot of time being really careful about how my assumptions influence my decisions. And I think that's why, because you really have to kind of live the problem before you can really truly understand what the solution is.
Have you ever presumed something and it went to the opposite direction?
Well, like just simple things. Like, for example, we just went through this whole exercise of, creating fairly detailed roadmaps for a rather large engineering organization, almost 3,000 engineers. And, I just kind of walked in assuming that everybody had them. I'm like, okay, let's check out the roadmaps, right? Or knew how to create one or knew how to use one. And I think that, that's kind of a simplistic example, but those are the types of things that you just have to be really mindful of. And it wasn't so much that like people didn't know what they were, how to create one. I think what we really needed to do is tell a story about why they're useful, right? What are the scenarios where roadmaps really help us as an organization build the best product that we can? And how is that meaningful for the business, right? Like what's the commercial benefit of that? And so it's that story that I didn't tell that I realized later, after the fact, that I needed to spend more time telling that story and really convincing people that this was worth their time.
Speaking of working with the engineering team, you taught yourself how to code. Have you ever trained your other skills to become a better PM? In other words, what are some core skills a PM should have?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, the type of product that they're going to work on or what they want to work on. the kind of like urban legend that you need to have a computer science degree in order to be good at product management, I think is both true and false, right? It means, and I always say that like, there are some engineers that would make great product managers. And there's some that just wouldn't. Right. And so, I think understanding, not like understanding how to write code. And by the way, when I learned how to write code, the other thing I learned quickly was that was not going to be an efficient use of how I was going to earn a living. But I understood the basic principles. And I think that that's the core, that's the key fundamental is to understand the principles around computer science and good code. And, the other thing that I studied a lot that really I think has helped me is like systems theory, or even sociology and archaeology. Like even just having a framework for an approach, right? Like science is an empirical based method to basically validate something. And so it's that understanding how to use frameworks. I think the other thing that I learned, and maybe you don't necessarily have to take computer science to learn how to code to learn this, but I think pattern matching is something that has really served me well. And I think pattern matching is also something that serves computer scientists or people who write code really well. So, look, at Google, there was basically a rule that you couldn't be a product manager without a CS degree. And there was a couple of exceptions to that, myself included. But it was more or less just a filter that they used to increase the likelihood that the people they were hiring into those roles would be successful. But that's totally changed now, right? There are plenty of people that are incredibly good product managers that do not have technical degrees. So it's more about the frame or the framework that you use to think and how you break down problems that matter the most. And, especially in a client or customer or user heavy business or product, like I'll tell you what, the number one thing, if you really want to get good at product management, is go spend a week or a month doing product or tech support. Like literally try to talk people through on the phone how to fix things on their computers. That will help you. You know what I mean? Like I always joke that like, because I am the family IT department, like that is where I've learned some of my biggest insights, with regards to usability and just psychology and human behavior. And so I think there's lots of ways to kind of like develop those muscles. But I think empathy is and kind of like being able to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else is really critical.
Totally agree. Empathy is really important. When it comes to creating a good experience and good product, one thing I find really hard is balancing empathy with finding the right target user. Sometimes prior to launching a good product, we have to test it out before we put it out to the market. How do you know who is your audience and what kind of feedback would you take actions on? Also, how do you collect feedback for the product before the official launch? For example, launching an app at Goldman Sachs, I assume your team can't just put out a prototype to the broader market. What are some actions for you to get feedbacks on the product?
Yeah, no, you're right. I don't think Goldman launches products in beta, so to speak, right? I don't think banks in general do that, because I think, the industry has the unique set of requirements that come with compliance and regulation. And it's a completely different, kind of product landscape, if you will. And so I think that you have to have a different approach. It's one of the reasons that I think user research has a really significant role in the overall product development process and just even the hypothesis testing process. And the same is true for, how we interact with our clients and customers. A lot of salespeople are really reluctant to, essentially let a bunch of product managers and engineers meet with their clients and ask them a bunch of questions. Right. And so, I think the key part there is from, in terms of the product development organization, in order for them to get successful insights from customers and clients, They have to really tell a compelling story and a compelling narrative. And I think they also have to truly understand what problems the customers and clients are facing. And so the tighter the relationship and the tighter the partnership that the development organization can have with the sales and client-facing organization, the more successful they're going to be at that. So I think you have to leverage a different set of tools. Obviously, it's not like you can run a bunch of A/B tests, right? Or it's not like you can siphon off 0.10% of traffic and, get a statistically significant variance such that you can make some sort of decision. And so I think that's a big part of the process. One of the things that we've done at Goldman is really embraced, Amazon's working backwards from the customer approach. And one of the mechanisms of that approach involves a pretty lengthy process around writing down, who's the customer, what is their problem, how do we know that this problem matters, what's the opportunity, and what's unique to Goldman is this idea of a consensus-driven culture, which means that you get to leverage a lot of different perspectives, and that's not just within the engineering organization, right? And so I remember being frustrated at first with the fact that I had to have 30 meetings with people. And it felt like things were going to move, we're moving so much slower. And then I realized that I wasn't taking advantage of this huge opportunity, which is that I could lean in to 30 people or have 30 meetings to really ask as many questions as I wanted. And so, I think that that's a process that we're iterating on. And I think it's an approach that will help us specifically because of the unique nature of our problem, the context of our problem. But I don't think there's a perfect answer. It's something that we'll have to iterate on, And I think that the key there is to constantly be questioning how is this working? What can we do to make it better? But the other critical thing, in order for all of this to work, is to be very clear about what the success metrics are, right? Like, how are we going to know if this work is actually having an impact? And that's critical.
Your career moves really fast. You've joined Google in your early 30s. Now you're the chief product officer of the engineering division at Goldman Sachs. And you look very young. How do you accelerate your career growth? Many people never got to where you are today. What are something that you're actively doing to make yourself more successful? Another sub-question on that note, whenever people go to a job interview, the job normally requires someone who does exactly that job before. If you haven't done something in the past, how do you convince people to give you that job?
Right. So the key thing is to say, and by the way, I did this when I was at Google. I'm like, yeah, I've never, this is my first job, but let me tell you about all the things that made me successful as an athlete and why they're going to be useful here. Right. And so I think that that's the key, is that you have to be able to talk about how what you did, is essentially a predictor of success. Cause that's all an interview is, right? It's basically, and it's not my favorite way for identifying somebody who's going to be successful in a role. But, I tell people all the time that, it's really important to understand why you're doing this job. Like, what do you want out of it? Like, where do you get personal satisfaction? Forget about the comp, forget about the title, forget about the company's logo on your resume or your LinkedIn profile. Like, what are you really what are you getting out of this day to day? Like, for me personally, like, I've already written the story that I want to be able to tell in, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many years about what I accomplished at Goldman Sachs. And I am literally working backwards from that story. I'm like literally checking in on a regular basis and saying, am I doing the things that are going to enable me to tell this story? And so that's what I tell people. The same version of that when I was an athlete is I used to say at the beginning of the year, okay, my goal, one of my goals is to essentially do better than I did the year before. Right. And I would kind of like define, okay, what does better mean? And, you know, and I would have a bunch of ideas around what better meant. And then I would create very clear deliverables, right? Like I remember this one year, I was kind of like just on the cusp of getting a professional contract, and I had gotten so close and turned down. And I said, okay, this is it. This is the last year that I'm going to do this on prize money. And I said, here are the races I'm going to win. And if that doesn't get me a professional contract, I'm done. I'm quitting. Right. And so that was super motivating. And so I think people need to think about their careers the same way, right? Like talk about, you know, think about the story you want to be able to tell, you know, at the end or when you reach some milestone, and then work backwards from that. And I think that that's really critical.
Yeah, that's such a great strategy. I feel like it's also super implementable and love it. So
can I tell a funny story? Can I tell a funny story related to that first? I remember I was an amateur and I was racing in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And the next weekend was this really big race in Seattle. And it was like $10,000 to win, which, you know, at that time was a lot of money. And I was completely out of money. And so what I did was there was one more race in Altoona. And, you know, each race has a prize list, and you could look at like first place gets this much, second place, third place, fourth place, fifth place, you know, so on and so forth. So I figured out that I needed like $420 to buy a plane ticket from Philadelphia to Seattle. And then I looked down the prize list to figure out what place did I need to get in order to get at least $420. And that was third place. I had to get third place or better, or I was going to be stuck in Pennsylvania. So the next day I got second. And so but super motivated, very, very clear, you know, metrics, really, really like specific objectives. And, you know, I think that there's a lot to be said for that type of motivation and planning.
That's such a great story. And I absolutely agree that to set a benchmark will definitely motivates you to go a little bit farther than you would have. So I have a 1 minute fire round for you.
Okay.
First question is like, what's your favorite book?
Favorite book? Well, I'm in the middle of it right now. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel.
That's a good book. It's a classic.
Yeah, it's a classic. It's a good one right now, especially.
Yeah. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
My dad.
I mean, what did he do to you?
So I had this this job at a consulting firm in Philadelphia. Right, I graduated from school, and I decided that all I really wanted to do was race my bike, and if I didn't do it, I would spend the rest of my life regretting it. So I flew back to California, and I had a meeting with my dad, and I said, Dad, I want to do this, and I have a student loan, and would you pay my student loan for a year while I try to do this? And he said, yep, no problem.
That's so sweet. And yeah, like I feel like it's always great to have supportive parents who supports your dream instead of asking you to be a doctor or lawyer or something.
Yeah. Well, they all thought I was crazy, to be fair.
Well, but you did what you did, and then look at where you are now. So I'm sure he is like extremely proud. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Who would I invite to my dinner party? Well, definitely one of my neighbors, because I love having neighbors at dinner parties. How many people can I invite, by the way?
It's your party, so however much you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think neighbors right now really matter a lot because I just moved to a new neighborhood and we're trying to connect with neighbors. But I think, if I was going to throw a dinner party tomorrow and COVID was over, in addition to my neighbor, I would invite like just the most diverse group of people that I could imagine. I think one of the biggest things that I've really enjoyed about coming to work at Goldman Sachs is just getting to meet people with such diverse backgrounds and diverse perspectives. And because everybody I work with is not an engineer or a product manager or designer or user researcher, it really, I think gives me an opportunity to kind of expand my view of things. Mm-hmm. And so that's the way I kind of think about dinner parties.
Where can we find you outside of work?
On my bike.
Yeah, that's what I assume. Also Peloton or something.
Yeah, or I should say my mountain bike recently, because my son is really crazy about mountain bikes, and all he wants to do is be a YouTuber with a van and mountain bikes and stuff like that. So
yeah, that's awesome. Well, Dylan, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was fun to talk about all this stuff. Thank you for your questions.
All right. That's all we have for today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Smart Venture Podcast. If you like it, please leave us a quick review and hit subscribe so you don't miss any tips from the experts. If you want to receive our updates, please leave your email at smartventurepod.com. If you want to connect with me, all my socials are at Grace Gong GG. Beside LinkedIn, it's just Grace Gong. I'd love to connect with you and let me know your thought about the show. Now you can also listen to Smart Venture Podcast on YouTube. Go to smartventurepod.com, click the YouTube link on the top banner. Don't forget to hit subscribe and smash the like button. See you next time.